Sometimes the most unexpected moments happen when we stop rushing and simply exist. Picture this: a late-night flight, the hum of the engines filling the quiet cabin. A woman in a sharp business suit, a CEO known for her discipline and composure, boards the plane exhausted after a week of back-to-back meetings. She's the kind of person who never lets her guard down, always in control, always focused, always distant from the world around her. She finds her seat beside a man holding a small child. The man's eyes are tired but kind, and the way he gently adjusts his daughter's blanket speaks volumes about who he is, a single father doing his best. The CEO gives a polite nod, puts on her headphones, and closes her eyes, telling herself she'll just rest for a moment. But fatigue wins. As the plane takes off and the cabin lights dim, her head tilts, resting softly on the man's shoulder. He freezes for a second, unsure what to do, but then simply smiles, careful not to move. When she wakes up mid-flight, embarrassed and apologizing, he says something so genuine, so unexpectedly kind, that it catches her completely off guard. That single exchange, and born from exhaustion, kindness, and quiet understanding, becomes the start of a story that neither of them could have imagined. True connection often begins in the most ordinary, unplanned moments. The CEO had spent most of her life believing that success required walls, boundaries between her and everyone else. She was known for her precision, her discipline, and her ability to make hard decisions without emotion clouding her judgment. Her life was measured in numbers, contracts, and schedules. But as she boarded that late-night flight, exhaustion had begun to carve deep lines into her expression. She was flying home after another week of endless meetings and sleepless nights, her mind still spinning with deals and deadlines. The last thing she expected was that a simple mistake, falling, asleep on a stranger's shoulder, would remind her of what it meant to feel human. Again, the man sitting beside her was nothing like the people she usually met in her world. He wore no designer suit, no expensive watch, and his hands were rough, marked with the quiet labor of responsibility. Beside him sat a little girl, probably 6 or 7, her head resting against his arm as she clutched a small stuffed rabbit. There was something about them, the quiet tenderness between the two, that stood in stark contrast to the chaos she carried inside. But she was too tired to notice for long. As the plane ascended and the cabin lights dimmed, she leaned back, meaning only to close her eyes for a few minutes. Minutes turned into hours. Somewhere over the clouds, her head had tilted, coming to rest gently on the man's shoulder. He froze for a moment, startled, but when he saw how peaceful she looked, his expression softened. It had been a long time since anyone had leaned on him like that. He didn't move. The hum of the engines filled the silence, and he looked down at his sleeping daughter, then at the stranger resting against him, and smiled quietly. Life had a strange way of putting people side by side, two completely different worlds crossing paths somewhere above the earth. When she woke up, the embarrassment hit her instantly. Her eyes widened and she sat up straight, mumbling an apology, her usual composure cracking. She expected irritation or discomfort, but instead the man chuckled softly and said, "You looked like you needed the rest. Don't worry about it." His voice was calm, genuine, without a trace of mockery. That simple kindness disarmed her. She wasn't used to people being gentle without reason. In her world, everything came with a price. But this man, this stranger, treated her with warmth that expected nothing in return. For the rest of the flight, she found herself glancing at him and his daughter. The little girl woke up halfway through, sleepy-eyed and curious, and asked her father if they were almost home. The way he smiled at her, the way his hand brushed her hair, carried a tenderness the CEO hadn't seen in years. She asked if it was just the two of them, and he nodded, explaining softly that his wife had passed away when their daughter was very young. His tone wasn't bitter, just honest, carrying the weight of quiet endurance. Something inside her shifted as she listened. She realized that this man, despite having far less than she did, carried more warmth in his eyes than most people she met in boardrooms full of ambition. His strength wasn't loud or visible. It was quiet and steady, built from love and sacrifice. She began to ask questions about his daughter, his job, his life, and he answered humbly, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking away with a kind of shyness that made him seem even more genuine. It wasn't the kind of conversation that changed the world, but it changed something in her. As the flight went on, the walls she had built so carefully began to soften. She laughed at small things, something she hadn't done in months. The little girl offered her a piece of candy and she accepted it, surprising even herself. She found herself listening to the child talk about her favorite books, her dreams, her late mother's recipes. The CEO had spent years trying to fill her life with achievements. But in that small moment, at 30,000 feet above the clouds, she felt something that all her success had failed to give her: peace. It dawned on her that connection isn't always about shared interests or backgrounds. Sometimes it's about a shared silence, a shared humanity, a shared need to feel seen. She realized how lonely she had been, how distant from the world she had become, and all it took was a stranger's shoulder and a child's innocent smile to remind her of what she had lost. When the plane began to descend, she felt an unexpected ache in her chest. She didn't want the moment to end. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something pure, something that reminded her of the world beyond work and ambition. She helped the man gather his daughter's things, and when they stood to leave, she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes. As they walked down the terminal, the little girl looked up at her and said, "You should sit with us again next time." The CEO laughed softly, promising she would if fate allowed it. The man smiled, nodded politely, and thanked her for the company. It was a simple exchange, but it lingered in her heart long after they went their separate ways. That night, when she returned to her luxurious apartment, she looked out at the city lights, the skyline she had conquered, and realized how hollow it all felt compared to the quiet comfort of that shared moment on the plane. True connection, she thought, doesn't happen at fancy events or through polished conversations. It happens when we least expect it, in the spaces between exhaustion and grace, between loneliness and laughter, between two souls who never planned to meet but needed each other just the same. Kindness from a stranger can awaken the humanity we forget we have. For years, the CEO had trained herself to live in a world where empathy was weakness and compassion was a distraction. She had climbed her way to the top of an empire built on precision, logic, and strategy. Her days were dictated by meetings, deals, and the constant pursuit of perfection. She had learned to silence her emotions, to hide behind sharp words and cold composure. But all of that control, all of that discipline, began to feel fragile the moment she encountered a stranger's simple act of kindness on that flight. After she woke from her unplanned nap against the single father's shoulder, she expected him to be annoyed, perhaps even angry. In her experience, people didn't tolerate inconvenience without complaint, but instead he just smiled, gently reassuring her that it was fine, that she must have been tired. His tone wasn't sarcastic or dismissive, it was understanding. That one gesture, that effortless empathy, caught her completely off guard. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to her with that kind of warmth, with no agenda hidden beneath the surface. She tried to regain her composure, brushing off her hair and muttering something about her schedule and how busy she had been, but he didn't seem impressed by her position or status. He simply nodded, as if success or titles didn't matter to him at all. He adjusted his daughter's blanket, made sure she was comfortable, and then turned back to her with a kind of quiet patience that unsettled her in the gentlest way. For a moment, she didn't know what to do with that feeling, the sense of being treated not as a CEO, not as a symbol of power, but simply as a person. The man, a single father, began to share small pieces of his life in passing. He wasn't talkative, but when he did speak, there was sincerity in every word. He told her about his daughter's favorite bedtime stories, how she insisted on carrying her stuffed rabbit everywhere, and how she would refuse to sleep unless he sang her a lullaby. His voice softened whenever he mentioned her, and it was impossible not to notice the deep love he carried for his little girl. The CEO listened, at first out of politeness, but then because she wanted to. She found herself drawn to the simplicity of his world, a world where love and responsibility mattered more than money or prestige. As the conversation unfolded, she began to realize how much she had lost in her pursuit of success. There had been a time when she cared about people, when she believed in kindness, but that part of her had been buried under years of stress and ambition. The stranger's calm, his warmth, and his effortless grace began to pull those forgotten parts of her back to life. He didn't know it, but with every word he was showing her something she hadn't felt in years: genuine humanity. The little girl woke up and shyly asked her father for juice. He smiled and handed her a small bottle from his bag. Then, noticing that the CEO looked exhausted, he quietly offered her a spare snack pack his daughter hadn't eaten. She insists I carry extra, he said with a small laugh. The gesture was so small, so ordinary, but it made her chest tighten. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had done something kind for her without expecting something in return. In her world, everything was transactional. Yet here, in this quiet space thousands of feet above the ground, kindness was freely given, without hesitation or motive. The little girl turned to her and asked, "Do you have kids?" The question caught her off guard. She shook her head, and the girl frowned slightly, saying, "You'd be a good mom. You have kind eyes." The CEO didn't know how to respond. She had spent years hearing compliments about her intelligence, her leadership, her success, but no one had ever called her kind. The words of that innocent child pierced through the layers of armor she'd built. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen for something that had nothing to do with her achievements. As the flight continued, she found herself opening up in ways she never expected. She told them about her own childhood, how her father had worked long hours, and how she had learned early on to rely only on herself. The man listened attentively, never interrupting, never judging. When she paused, he said something simple yet profound. "Sometimes, people forget that strength and kindness can exist in the same person. One doesn't have to erase the other." Those words echoed in her mind long after he said them. She realized how hard she had been on herself and on others. Her success had come at the cost of her softness, her humanity. Yet in this stranger's presence, she didn't feel weak for being vulnerable. She felt human. It was as if his quiet compassion had given her permission to breathe again. To remember that beneath the armor of leadership and authority, she was still capable of warmth, empathy, and care. When turbulence hit, she instinctively gripped the armrest. The man noticed and placed his hand over hers, steady but gentle, saying, "It's all right, just a little rough air." It wasn't romantic. It was reassuring, protective, deeply kind. She hadn't realized how much she needed that small act of comfort until it happened. In that fleeting moment, she understood that kindness doesn't have to be grand or dramatic to be powerful. Sometimes it's a soft word, a quiet presence, or the simple act of holding on when someone else is scared. As the plane descended, she watched the single dad and his daughter prepare to leave. The girl smiled and waved goodbye, and the man gave a polite nod before walking away. The CEO sat in her seat a moment longer, feeling something she couldn't quite name, a mixture of gratitude, peace, and longing. That flight, that small encounter, had reminded her that success means nothing without connection, and that kindness from a stranger can awaken something within us that we didn't even know was asleep. In the end, this story reminds us that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the deepest impact. A shared seat, a simple smile, a few kind words, they can awaken parts of us we thought were long gone. Kindness doesn't need wealth or status. It only needs a heart willing to care. The CEO boarded that flight believing she had everything, yet it was a stranger's quiet compassion that reminded her of what truly matters: humanity, connection, and the courage to feel again. Because often it's not grand moments that change us, but the gentle ones that remind us we're still human,